often exciting to look to the future of UNO, what it might be like in times to come. Sometimes, though, it's important to stop and take a good look at the past of the university, the people and the happenings that help make the excitement of future history possible. With this in mind, join me for Reflections in Time.
Hello again, and welcome to another edition of what I like to call Reflections in Time. We're visiting in the summer of 1983, and we're visiting this time with a friend of mine and a colleague of many, many years, Bill Gerbracht. Bill is currently the registrar at our university in Nebraska at Omaha, but he came to the university a number of years ago. In fact, he came as a student in, I believe, 1946. Is that right, Bill?
That's right.
And after he graduated in 1949, he stayed on at the university and has been here in all the ensuing years, and he had such a variety of jobs. We counted them up, and I don't know if Bill ever had, but I want to list them before we begin visiting today to give you an idea of the scope of what Bill has been involved with our University of Omaha and then the University of Nebraska at Omaha over these many, many years. First of all, and correct me if I'm wrong as I go along here, Bill, he was the vocational counsel at the VA Center, then administrative assistant in student placement work, then the director of the conference center, then the director of student placement, director of the student center, and also activities director at that time, right, Bill?
Right.
Then he became director of financial aid. Then he moved into student activity more fully again as assistant and then associate dean of students, and finally the associate registrar, and more finally right now in 1983 as we record this visit, Bill is our registrar. Bill? That's a great variety of jobs over a period of a number of years. I'm not going to ask you which one you've liked the best, but I would like to ask you something that even though I've known you for about 30 years, I wasn't aware of your roots. Where do you come from, Bill, and what kind of a background do you come out of as you came to the university, and how you ended up here, because I believe you were born in South Dakota, right?
Once again, you're right, Paul. I was born and raised in South Dakota. My family moved here when I was 16 years old, roughly in 1941. I finished up high school here at South High School, and then immediately went into the service.
What branch of service were you in?
I was in the Army, and I was a court reporter during service.
Oh, were you?
Toted a typewriter instead of a gun. I was discharged in March of 1946, excuse me, and I came to the university as a student in June of that year.
Now, think back, if you will, Bill, to 1946 in June, and as you came on the campus, I suppose it was kind of fairly new around here. The main building over there that we've been housed in off and on for so long, that wasn't very old, was it?
No, as a matter of fact, the building was completed in 1938, and at that time it housed the total university. The library, the cafeteria, all of the classrooms, all of the faculty offices, all of the service entities which we had at that time were all housed in that one building.
Even the gymnasium, right?
Even the gymnasium and the, quote, university theater.
Yeah, they shared
the facility.
Yes. And literally you could come to school or to work here as a part of the staff and never leave the building all day and all night, right?
That's true. That is true.
Do you recall, you know, as we sit here now and we're recording this, friends, in the beautiful new Hyper building faculty lounge. Of course, this building wasn't here, nor were nearly any of the buildings surrounding it. What did we have out here? Were there homes? Was it just a big field? We had 52 acres, as I recall, even in the early years there.
That is correct. The 52 acres, which ran from roughly 60th Street West, made up the entire campus, the bulk of which at that time was a very nice alfalfa field.
Ah, well, we were really pretty much out of town, right?
Yes, the end of the bus line, as it were.
Now, as you came to school as a service-related veteran of court reporting, what was it like? Was it very small? About how many students did it have? Things like that.
Well, of course, we had the influx of World War II veterans
Yeah,
at that time,
yeah.
Paul, and the university was crowded, even though I believe our total enrollment, both day and night, ran probably about 4,800.
Which was bigger than the night?
Well, at that time, I believe that we had a slight edge in the day school because of the huge number of veterans. The males outnumbered the females dangerously close to 3 to 1
Yes,
in the period of 46 to 48. And it was crowded. There's no question about it. The initial relief we experienced, I believe, was in 1947 when the White House, as it was later called, the shack, as it was affectionately called by everyone, was opened directly southwest of the administration building and housed, let's see, it was a snack shack, an adjunct bookstore, a catch-all for equipment, and anything else that happened to go in there at the moment.
Yeah, one of the first major temporary permanent buildings, right?
That's right. It lasted until just last year, as you recall.
Yes, it was here for a long, long time. And that was really sort of the hub of student fun, wasn't it? Everybody, that's a place to get together and have a Coke and chew the
That's
fat,
right.
and
That's
fraternity tables, things like that.
Where the student body really did things. As a matter of fact, it was more than that. A number of the World War II veterans were avid gamblers, particularly good card players.
Do you want to be numbered among them?
Well, we had one small group that concentrated on playing bridge for a penny, well, a tenth of a cent a point, which was pretty good money.
Yeah.
And I hate to admit it, but we had some students who made more money playing bridge than they did at any legitimate pursuit. Now, you understand, of course, the president didn't know about that.
No, of course not. But and some people were able probably to, as a part-time worker in bridge, pay for their tuition.
That's right.
Which
Tuition
wasn't very big those days. What was it like, you remember?
I believe when I first came, it was $3.50 an hour and was raised to $4 for residents, and non-residents paid the whole sum of $1 more per credit hour.
So all told, you could go to school for a semester for, even with bus fare, or buy some gas for maybe $100, $150 for everything, really.
Oh, very easily.
Yeah.
No problem at all.
But many of you, like yourself, were on, I suppose, the GI Bill, weren't you?
Oh, yes.
So that was a nice arrangement, really.
You know, the historical pattern at this institution, Paul, and I was thinking about this earlier, those periods in time when things happened in the nation and in the community to save this institution and keep it going. One of those was that GI Bill that you just talked about. There's no question that the influx of veterans at that time, with all of their tuition fees and books paid by the federal government, paid the way of this institution for a period of about, I would say 46 to 51.
Is that right?
And was the difference between keeping the place afloat. Then, of course, in 51, the vote on the mill levy,
Yes.
providing us with an additional $90,000 to $100,000 a year, once again, was a financial impetus that kept us going. Following that, we had the bootstrappers. And, of course, following that, the junior college bill, and then these things that have led to where we presently are. But it all had its genesis back in that GI Bill, I believe.
I'm interested in hearing you say that. Really, that was, from your standpoint, the base for our continuing this university, really. All the post-war period there, really, and the GI Bill.
In my opinion, yes.
Yeah. Do you remember at any one time how many we had of you guys and gals? How many there were?
I would say we peaked at about 1948 with at least 3,000.
Now, that's the size of number of students.
Both full and part-time.
Because our student body at this university for a long time wasn't nearly that big at all with anyone.
No.
And certainly coming out of World War II, it was very small till everyone like yourself hit the campus here. What did you decide to major in?
Well, I had a varied academic career. I couldn't make up my mind.
Well, as you well know now as registrar, there are lots of people like that.
However, I wound up with kind of a dual major in foreign languages and psychology.
Foreign language? I didn't realize that.
Actually, majoring in foreign language took care of me a little bit later in that I taught French for a number of years in the College of Continuing Studies, and that extra $120 a semester I got for doing that was sometimes the difference.
Is that right? So you got a psych and a language major.
Right.
It's interesting, isn't it, how sometimes in later years when we reflect on what we majored in, it has no special connection to what we happen to be doing.
How true.
Yeah. So, as you first came out, then for some reason, a lot of people go other places, but you decided to, for whatever reason, stay here at the University of Omaha. Do you remember how it happened and why you stayed and who helped get it done? What's the history of that, Bill?
Well, I started as a student assistant in fall of 1947, working in the old Vocational Guidance Center.
Now, where was that, Bill?
That was down on the first floor, what is now sociology offices.
I got to thinking that was off campus, but it wasn't. It was right here on the first floor there.
It was right here.
Yeah.
And I went to work there as a clerk typist, literally, typing cases for the people in the counseling center. And when I graduated in '49 as a direct outgrowth of that apprenticeship, if you will, I was offered a job as a counselor in the department, and that was my entree into my first full-time job.
Ah. Who was heading that operation up at that time?
There was a VA director, of course, and then the university portion was headed up by Jack Woods,
oh, yes,
who was director of placement and kind of a father confessor for all veterans.
So, in effect, Woods was your first boss here on campus?
Yes.
How was the job market in Omaha and around the Middle West at the time you graduated? As we record this in 1983, we know our students are having tough times, some of them finding the kind of work they'd like to do.
As I remember, when I graduated, and I had a reasonably good academic record, I had two job offers. One to stay at the university at $3,000 a year.
Which was not bad salary in those days.
And the other offer was from the Omaha Public Schools at $2,400 a year. And that was a pretty easy decision to make.
Yes. What kind of work would you have been doing if you'd gone with OPS?
Teaching.
Teaching?
Teaching foreign languages.
Ah. So, as you started, you worked in non-teaching activity, really.
That's right.
And let's go back to your program. You were mentioning your psych and your foreign language major. If you're going to make a list of teachers and interesting students that come to mind, some of whom may be looking at this tape one of these days, who are some people that come to mind that were your professors and so on?
Well, we really had a small cadre of what I regarded as truly gifted teachers.
Who was the president when you came?
Roland Haynes.
Ah, yes. Haynes was still the president, was he not? Go ahead, Bill.
Roland Haynes was not the typical college administrator as we think of them today. He was a gentle, shy, almost diffident man. A classical Greek scholar who wore his Phi Beta Kappa pin proudly on his watch fob.
I remember him around campus when I came.
And the people whom he hired to teach at this institution, many of them were truly gifted teachers. No emphasis on research or any of the things that are so important today, but on pure teaching. And I think of men like Leslie Garlow,
yes,
and Claude Thompson, and Bill Thompson, and William Waite, and many others who made a tremendous mark, if you will, on everyone whom they touched, all for the better, and were really fine teachers.
The faculty, of course, was very small, wasn't it? There weren't any large departments, so I imagine you'd have some of these same gifted teachers more than once, wouldn't you?
Well, you kept going back to them if you could. As a matter of fact, Paul, as I recall, the faculty in 1947 was comprised of 60 full-time, part-time people.
That took care of it. And do you remember what the enrollment was then about?
Well, I would say, again, bordering on the 5,000 mark, both full and part-time.
Well, that ended up being some load for these various 60 people, didn't it?
Well, I think in the evening sessions there were probably some adjunct people whom I didn't include in that 60.
Well, even so, I imagine many did double duty, teaching
2 or 3
courses in the day and a long session at night.
part of the contract teaching load at this institution then, everyone taught 15 hours.
That was basic, wasn't it?
3 of which had to be taught in the evening division.
Oh, 1 course at least at night for everybody.
For everybody.
That probably included deans even.
Probably.
Do you remember, those were interesting things, Bill. Do you remember generally, and you've seen so many student bodies, what was the flavor of the student body? What was it like?
Some called it flavor, some called it odor. I mean, it depended on which side of the table you were sitting on.
Was it sort of a gung-ho student kind of group? Were they kind of militant? What were they like? Did they have a character sort of all their own? As you compare them maybe to more recent years.
I think one of the things that I miss most about the old days, as all of we older people tend to do, is the fact that our student body in the late 40s and in the early 50s were active people. They felt for the university, they felt for the community. They gave freely of themselves, literally, to do things for the institution. We had traditions then that kind of inspired them in a way to do these things.
I was wondering the motivation for that.
Well, a case in point, in 1951, when we had the horrible flood, the last horrible flood on the Missouri,
right.
The student body at this institution rose up as one to work on the dikes down there, on the levees, sandbags and that sort of thing. When it came time to go to the voters to ask for an increase in the mill levy, the student body of this institution, led by the student organizations, here again, went out and knocked on doors and carried petitions and did all of those things which enabled us to get that vote that gave us the additional mill. I think that spirit left the institution, along with the traditions of the institution, somewhere in the mid-60s. And since then, to me, it is a very depersonalized, a very inactive student body.
And Bill, as we ended up that first tape, you made an interesting comment. I thought you felt and feel that if I could put it into one little ball of wax, student spirit, maybe faculty, staff spirit, spirit of the core for the university, pretty well died out, and we became depersonalized, sort of just a big university in sometime in the 60s, right?
That's right.
Now, back when you were a student, as you were describing in tape 1 there, in the 40s and the early 50s, as you began your full-time work here as part of the staff and faculty, we were still pretty small. Wouldn't that have been one of the main reasons why we, smaller groups, small families, this, that, they tend to stick together? Wouldn't that be part of the cohesion and spirit?
I think that probably is very definitely one of the reasons. Quite a large percentage of the student body at that time, if they were here full-time or close to it, belonged to something.
Oh,
a
group.
That's right. Now, I'm not referring exclusively to the fraternities and sororities, but they were the nucleus of it.
We had an active independent student organization too, didn't we?
Yes, they had a very active independent student organization, and we had very active clubs and that sort of thing.
Well, like what?
Well, for example, the language clubs were flourishing. The special interest groups actually met and did things, were a part of the whole. And I think that was part of it. People tend to get enthusiastic only if they give something of themselves to something, become a part of it with activities. And our students did that then, at that time, and I think that our faculty did it too, partly from necessity, because it was something that Dr. Bale not only fostered, but actually pressured people to do.
So that faculty would need to be involved.
Faculty became involved, and in the course of that, their families became involved, the students' families became involved, so that these did become university affairs. And I think those were reflected in such things as, now this is trite and not necessarily very world-shaking, but there was The Maui Day Parade every year.
I remember. That was a big thing.
The kids getting out and literally working all night to build floats, their parents helping them. Going through that whole procedure on Maui Day, the downtown parade down through the city of Omaha, I think that this was a tradition that did something for the institution. It made it college life, if you will.
Memorable. And
made it memorable and worthwhile. We lost that in the 60s. Now, as we all know, in the 60s we had the national foment, the San Franciscos, the hippies, the rebellion against the constituted authority. Happily here in Nebraska, that came to us rather late. And at that time, I was in the Dean of Students' office then, and that was a literal hot spot. It really was, because when it finally did hit us, the student discontent and unrest, it was all focused on student personnel and people in it. In that literally we were forced to deal with it. It never got as intense here as it did some places. But just as an example of what the 60s were in higher education, that building that we can't look at from this window, but which on the east end of our campus, Kaiser Hall, which looks like a giant silo with no windows in it. You know why there are no windows in it?
I honestly don't know.
Because the architect at the time was influenced, mind you, by the student unrest and the rock throwing and destruction on other campuses, and didn't put any windows in it because of that reason.
Now that is interesting. And a sign certainly then of the times.
A sign of the times. I just use that as an example of what happens to higher education, even at low, small, somewhat provincial institutions like our own.
You know, going back from the 60s back into the 50s, that period shortly after you graduated, when you began working in various capacities. Let's talk a little about that. And as long as we're talking about student life, let's stay with that for the moment. Was the student of the 50s then much like the 40s and not very much like the 60s? Were they sort of in 10-year groupings, or would you break it down in any other ways for that period? Was the student profile beginning to change a little bit after you graduated?
I don't believe it changed markedly until the very late 50s and the early 60s.
There was still the great influence of the bootstrappers, the veterans and so on, through all that period, wasn't there?
Oh, yes. The influx of bootstrappers at this institution hit at about the time that the peak wave of World War II veterans declined. And once again, going back to something I said earlier, were in a sense the financial salvation of the institution. At one time, we were running approximately 1,000 of those very mature military people through this institution and awarding them degrees in a period of 6 months. And in the course of the year, those people were leaving $2 million in the Omaha economy each and every year. And here is another one of those financial boosts to the university, which kept us going.
You know, when you talk about the bootstrappers, and I've had long attachment to them too as a teacher and as administrator part of the time too, I think they, as well as the veterans generally that you mentioned, had a really great impact on the campus. And I'd like to have you reflect on that a little bit. There are so many ways they were a strong force, weren't they?
Yes, they were. They were a definite power for good. Now, everyone won't agree with that.
No.
I think from a purely student standpoint, they were feared because they represented maturity and intellectual capacity beyond that of the average student, so that a bootstrapper in a class was real competition for grades.
Yes.
And as such was feared. On the other hand, they brought maturity and knowledge and understanding of the world into the classroom, and I'm sure made a great contribution to the overall education of the young people who were in there simply as a result of their life experiences.
Yeah, don't you think they gave us a nice mix of those who hadn't been out and around much and those that had?
Oh, yes.
Along with being so motivated for working hard, getting good grades, and learning. I think it made it easier on the faculty to have them. They were a tremendous help in terms of the tone of a class.
Interestingly enough, however, some faculty feared them too.
Is that right?
Yes, because unfortunately, in some instances, and very few I'm sure, some of those bootstrappers' life experiences probably were far in excess intellectually of those who were teaching them.
It made for some embarrassing moments.
Yes, indeed.
Probably for some of the younger and less experienced faculty. But overall, the impact was great, whether for good or ill, and I agree with you, Bill. I think they were a strong positive influence on the character of this institution. Now, let's wander around back there in the 50s again. We haven't gotten you anywhere through these 10 jobs yet. You're still back in, what's the first one again? Vocational. You were working for Jack Woods. And we really took off there like a rocket into various areas. That's fine. But now let's wander back through this maze of administrative and academic activity that you've been involved with. Second job. Remember which one it was?
The second job, actually the third, was Director of Conferences and Workshops in the Adult Education Department.
Who was the dean when you took that position?
The dean at that time was newly appointed. His name was Don Emery, a brilliant young man and a very able one. He was personable, talented, and a first-class administrator who did an excellent job. You probably recall that the University Library, the Eugene C. Epley Library, was completed in roughly 1956-57, and a portion of that building was called the Adult Education Conference Center, to provide educational experiences for adults in a non-traditional environment other than the classroom. Dr. Bale and Emery were both great supporters of the concept of adult education. The purpose of that wing, with 3 little classrooms and an auditorium and a lounge, was to provide the facilities for bringing community groups in for conferences, workshops, and learning experiences. It was tough to sell. It was tough to sell to the Omaha community. Because with everything at this institution, we, excuse the expression, financially had to crack the nut. It had to pay for itself or it couldn't go. And those were difficult times in that particular area. But from a slow beginning, it did build.
What sorts of conferences, workshops did we mainly have in that period? Can you recall some of the groups that...
Oh, some of them were wild. We'd take anybody who had money. I remember doing one for wallpaper salesmen. That was a dandy.
Did they leave their mark?
Well, on everything in sight, including my suit, as I recall. But
was this a seminar on how to hang it or how to sell it?
How to hang it. We did such things as a conference for tire salesmen. And literally anyone who wanted to provide a teaching environment to their personnel.
Yeah, that was the limitation. They had to have some, at least vague connection to teaching and learning, and
that's right.
More preferably to some department, university, right?
Then we tried to do that so that we could utilize some of our own faculty in the thing and give them a small honorarium.
That way you could tie the wallpaper into applied arts, probably, or something like that.
Interior decoration.
But literally, you were really scraping for groups, weren't you?
We certainly were. That went on for quite a long time, and it's hard to realize from those beginnings what we do now in the areas of adult education, which is really remarkable.
But yet, what you're describing here, Bill, what you did, what Dean Emery did, Dean Hausman before him, Osmond, who was the first dean, That's the framework for what we've got. That's the history. That's the base. We've been heavily oriented toward adult education through most of this university's life, have we not?
Oh, yes. There's no question about that. We have ties to the community and actually to the contiguous counties around here that go back to certainly the very early 30s.
Yes. And in those years, when we were smaller, we had a stronger attachment than we certainly do now in many ways, for a variety of reasons, to southwestern Iowa. Council Bluffs and those areas, and Potawatomi and around through there, right?
Yes, very definitely.
Because the tuition was not so great in a comparative way, and this was, for many people, their university too, was it not?
Yeah, and it was also pretty easy to fudge a little bit if you wanted to on those residency requirements.
Oh, they weren't the same as now.
Well, of course, technically, to qualify for residency for tuition purposes, you had to live within the confines of the city limits of Omaha.
Ah, inside the town.
Anyone who lived outside was a non-resident.
That was Nebraska, every place outside the perimeter of the city. That's it.
That's it.
What was the difference? Was it still $1.50 or so, like when you were a student? What did it become there in the 50s?
Well, I think it was, the percentage never varied much, roughly 25% to, say, 30% above the resident tuition cost. But we had a lot of people who lived with, who had mailing addresses at least, with grandparents and cousins and aunts and uncles in Omaha, which they used while they attended school here.
So our real out-of-student group were bigger than it showed up on the books.
Absolutely.
But as I was saying, we did have an attachment that went well beyond Omaha, especially across the river there, which I think in the light of more recent developments has changed quite a bit. How long were you connected with Dean Emory and adult education there in the 50s?
For about 3 years. And at I believe it was the fall of 1958 that Jack Woods retired as Director of Placement, and Dr. Bale asked me to take over that assignment. This is where, just as a little sidelight, you mentioned in my 10 jobs. Well, I kind of gained a reputation as a result of all my job changes as being Bale's troubleshooter. And only because when a job opened up and someone needed to be put in the slot on sometimes rather short notice, that sometimes fell to me. This, however, was not the case in that shot at Director of Placement, because I had had my initial training there with Woods.
Yes, that's right. You worked there shortly after graduation, didn't you?
Yes. So then I served as Director of Placement for, I guess, 3 or 4 years.
Did you like that?
I liked it very much, Paul, because it enabled me to have a great deal of student contact, and at the same time to make a great many contacts with the business community in Omaha, and to a certain extent on the national scale for those companies who recruited with us at that time. I thoroughly enjoyed that. Some of the greatest satisfaction I ever got in working was in seeing young people put in jobs in which they were interested, trained, and had some reasonable chance of success. I think that was the pleasure of it.
Yeah, some of those students may well be watching this tape one of these years. What kinds of openings were available in those years? We're talking about the 50s here, mid to late 50s, right?
Right.
Was the job market pretty good, for example, Bill?
The job market is always a cyclical thing, going with the economy, and it was as true then as it is today. At that time, of course, there was a great shortage of teachers.
Yes.
And we had a large number of people in the College of Education.
That are some of the strongest years for that college, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
It was just about that time, however, that national companies began recognizing us as a class, reputable institution, and started sending representatives here to recruit. Now, at the risk of stepping on some toes, I would say that the companies to which I'm referring are not local ones, but ones of national and international stature, such as IBM and, well, Xerox and all of the rest that now dot that placement board. But those were happy and fun times. I enjoyed them.
And interesting in what you said, you enjoyed your student contact, Jen. And so this puts you back in that area a little more than the work you'd done previous to that.
Yes, it did. And the one which I then had subsequent to that as Director of Student Activities and Director of the Student Center really plunged me into very close contact with students.
Yeah, what year did that occur?
That would be, and please don't hold me to these years, it gets a little foggy, you know.
Yeah.
But I believe that it was about 1961.
All right, now we're getting into those 60s. Were you beginning to notice by that time, Bill, and you were having, as you suggest, more and more student contact, really, and now with Student Center, out-of-student placement, all these activities, really getting close to students, were they starting to change in their attitudes? Was the spirit of the Corps starting to leave that you mentioned earlier, that sort of thing? Were we changing then a lot?
I think we were. I think that the rebellion, the rebellious spirit of the times was really reaching us. This, of course, was before the real advent of Vietnam, but all of the factors were there to make it really turbulent times. We had our first student demonstrations in the early 60s, mass protests.
What was the first demonstration? What form did it take? Do you recall, Bill?
The one which I most vividly recall, and it probably was the first, was one which was held out on the front steps of the Student Center, where a young student leader stood up and said that the greatest enemy in the world today was a suppressive force by the name of Don Flasterer. Now you'll recall our good friend Don Flasterer was anything but a suppressive force.
Yeah.
But to this young man, he represented all of the things, the authority figure. He represented an authority figure which represented to this student a real threat.
And that type of thinking was not exactly unique in those days. There were lots of people in that frame, weren't there?
Yes, including some faculty members.
So we were really into a period of unrest, questioning things. Spirit of the Corps, do it for the university, that sort of thing was sort of dwindling away.
It was.
Did it reflect more the times and the size of the university or the staff, or were the people really different?
Oh, I don't think people changed that much. It was the times. I'm just sure of that. It went along with the decline of the fraternities and sororities, the decline of student organizations.
Why did those things tend to decline there too? What was the rationale, do you think, for that?
I think part of that was due to the fraternities and sororities themselves. They were too slow to modify their traditional patterns of expected behavior to adapt to modern times. And students rebelled against the sometimes childish display that membership in fraternities and sororities generated.
Shirts, ties, haircuts,
and
beards.
Initiations and all of the childish stuff that went along with that. The fraternities did not change, and therefore they lost their membership. And to this date, they still haven't recovered.
Well, in that period then, did independent students, did that grow? Did that become stronger? Or was it just group problems generally?
I don't think the independent students grew particularly. I think that, if anything, the students just were rebelling against any traditional form of authority and any imposition of anything that would restrain what's good for me.
A very self-centered approach, you would say?
Very definitely. And on our campus, happily, it never got bad, as it did other places. But we certainly felt it. And the behavior of the administration reflected an almost a fear of what students might do.
Yeah, what would you say would be the most obvious reflection of that?
Oh, I think the sit-in over there in Naylor's office in the late 60s, when a group of students took over, and incidentally, Kirk Naylor handled that very well, in my opinion. I was the associate dean at that time, And it was a tough situation and a tough decision for Naylor to have to make. He made it with courage, and I think forestalled some far worse things from happening to us by insisting on the maintenance of order.
Yes. All in all, describe that affair a little more in detail. Maybe many people will have forgotten it.
It was a sit-in almost exclusively of black students who were demanding, and frankly at this point I don't even remember any of their specific demands, but a reflection of the times, certainly, reflecting changes in the way things were done for black people. They moved into Naylor's office, a group of 25, 30, parked themselves in there and refused to move. He asked them to leave, then told them to leave, and when they refused to do so, he called the police, who physically carried them out.
And so the sit-in didn't last a long, long time, and
No.
order was restored in the eyes of the university, and you're feeling he handled it well.
In that it never happened again.
Mm-hmm.
I think it was handled extremely well.
Yes, that was a troublesome time, though, but like you suggest, I agree, I was here too. Compared to other parts of the country, on the coast, for example, and other places, we had nothing in a comparative way, did we?
No.
Now, we've got to work our way through some more of these jobs, Bill.
Well, we're going to run out of tape.
Where were we when we jumped to the late 60s? You'll have to keep me on track here, Bill.
Oh, I went to the Student Center.
Yeah. Now, the Student Center. Here we have a new building, really, almost new, named after a man who we considered our leader for a long, long time here, Mabel L. I want to ask you after a while some of your feelings about our good Dr. Bale. But the Student Center, what did it represent? Well, taking it from your viewpoint, the job you had over, or the jobs you had over there, what was going on in the Student Center in those days? Of course, we were feeding students and faculty and staff, but beyond that.
Well, I think it was the hub of student life. It was the place where, if you wanted to do something with a group of students, a group of faculty, or whatever, that was the place to do it. It was a fun place. We outgrew it almost as soon as we moved into it, unfortunately.
Yes, we had some additions within a few years, didn't we?
Oh, yes.
Remember the sun deck?
Yes, and the winds that destroyed our patio furniture.
But that became part of the dining room, didn't it?
It's now the Nebraska room.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
But it was the focal point of the university for everything non-academic, in my opinion. We were extremely fortunate to have that Student Center building for a number of reasons, not the least of which were the financial ones well, for example, the fact that Gene Epley gave us enough money to build the library, freeing Milo's building fund, as it were, to start construction on the Student Center and the engineering building.
Mm-hmm. At about the same time.
At about the same time. We managed to build it without utilizing any student funds or student memberships, as is traditionally done with student unions throughout the country.
Now, what years are we talking about roughly there again, Bill? When did these buildings start to
Construction
take shape?
in the late 50s, like 58, somewhere in there. Since it wasn't built with student funds, it enabled Dr. Bale and the administration to impose some regulations on the operation of the building that made it indeed university operated and not student operated.
Do you think that was a good thing, Bill?
I think it was. Otherwise, it would have been impossible to impose, or enforce rather, some of the rather stringent requirements behavior that we had in the building at that time.
Do you remember some of the rules?
Do not involve the public in your private romantic affairs. Don't put your feet on the table. Don't sleep. Don't smoke in restricted areas. As we look back on them now, they do seem a little ridiculous.
I remember Dr. Bale calling across the dining room to a faculty member, telling him to take his hat off.
Yes.
Etc. And that's the kind of thing you were talking about, and those were rules that were enforced.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Without any great fuss on the part of the students, evidently.
No. At least not more than once.
That really brings us, we're dipping in and out of history here, but you had a long association with Dr. Bale. A few years later, he retired. I think you'd agree with me, and I'd like to have you talk a little about it, Bill. He had a tremendous impact on our university, the person that stands out in our memory perhaps more than anyone else. Whether we agree or disagree with everything Dr. Bale did, he was a force, was he not?
A force to be reckoned with.
Yes.
There's no question in my mind, and I say this without any hesitation and absolutely no reservations. Milo Bale was the man for the times at this institution when he came in 1949.
About the time you graduated from
And
college.
the only reason this institution survived and flourished from 1949 until 1965 was Milo Bale. Now, that sounds a little bit like adulation and hero worship, and I'll be the first to admit there's a little of that in there too. But Milo Bale gave so much of himself to make this institution what it is. Very few people will ever know the contribution he really made.
Dr. Bale, would you agree, was a driving force? He got and maintained attention, no matter where he was, no matter what he was doing. And that really helped our university, didn't it?
Oh, I think so. There are those who will disagree with this. But he was decisive, he was knowledgeable, he did things for this institution without stinting himself or anyone else. He literally worked himself to death to get things done.
There are those who have said, I think, and you'll agree, that he sort of ran this place like a high school. There were so many rules and stuff. Do you think that part of it was good too, Bill?
I think people resented it. That goes back to the benevolent despot concept which some people had of him. And I think that's true to a certain extent. He was a perfectionist. And he felt that if he demanded perfection in himself, he could demand it of other people, those who worked for him, and wouldn't take less. Incidentally, that philosophy of his would not survive in education today. But at the particular time in the history of this institution, it helped markedly in our success.
And you're saying, Bill, that our success, our being here, sitting here today in 1983, heavily responsible for that is Dr. Bale.
No question.
Now, when you think of that period when you were over in the Student Center, we're coming to the end of a third segment here, but you made an interesting observation a while ago, Bill, talking about student spirit and losing it, spirit of the corps. And yet here you were talking about, and you were one of the leaders over there of a student center, student facilities, student activities, a real home, not just the shack out back over there. Now they had a place. But we had problems, evidently. And it was all going, right, in spite of all that?
We had problems, but they were minimal problems. The return of the Vietnamese veterans was an interesting phenomenon along about that time that had a tremendous influence on the behavior of students and on the operation of that facility.
Well, and the last thing we were talking about was the Vietnamese veterans coming back, their impact, your work in the Student Center as Director of Programs, things like that. Then you, in what year, moved from there over into financial aid for students, still heavily tied to student life, but when did you go over there and why?
I went over there in late 1965. That was about the time, as you will recall, that we had a change of presidents at the institution. Dr. Bale retired.
Go through that period, if you will, Bill, from your vantage point, what you saw and absorbed, and your feelings about it, if you will.
Well, as you recall, the university in approximately 1963 initiated a drive to increase the mill levy from 1 mill to 2 mills. We all worked very hard on that, including Dr. Bale, to get the voters of Omaha to give us a little more money, a pittance really. And the voters, in their wisdom, declined and voted the mill levy down. And this is a personal opinion of mine, but I think that Dr. Bale regarded that as a kind of personal repudiation of himself and his program. And so therefore he retired.
Do you feel that no vote was heavily responsible for his retiring then?
Well, I think he would have stayed on a couple of more years perhaps until he was 70.
Mm-hmm.
But he felt when that happened, and he never should have felt that way, but he did, taking it rather personally, that it was time for him to step down. And so he resigned, retired, and his successor was Dr. Leland Trawick, who came on board in, I believe it was late 1965.
In the fall of 1965 somewhere,
I
right?
believe so, and it was shortly after that that I was moved to the job of Director of Financial Aid.
Now, the Trawick year or so, reflections on that, Bill, before we talk about financial aid. Dr. Trawick wasn't here very long, was he?
No, for the good of the institution and all of us who were here at the same time. Dr. Trawick was a pompous, conceited ass who was more concerned about personal aggrandizement than he was in the welfare of the institution or its students. Part of this is sour grapes on my part because of my own relationship with him wasn't too good, but nonetheless, I think that most dispassionate, objective observers would agree with me. He was totally useless as a college administrator.
I recall we spent a lot of money on his inauguration.
Coronation.
Coronation, thank you.
As it more appropriately should be called. And that was about his only claim to fame. In a very short period of time, he had brought this institution to almost financial chaos. He had no sense of budget or any of those things that are so important to see a marginal institution succeed. As I say, happily he wasn't here very long, and happily he was succeeded by another very able man, Kirk Naylor, a much different personality than Milo Bale, but in his own way made contributions equally as great.
Thank you for those observations. I want to come back to your feelings about Dr. Naylor, but first, your work in financial aid. How long were you there? What did you generally involve yourself in those years as?
Well, financial aid at that time was a fledgling operation. It was literally just getting started. The federal government had not been in the financial aid business very long. In fact, National Student Defense Loans had been in operation only about 4 or 5 years. About the time I hit the job, there was a tremendous increase in the amount of federal monies made available for student financial aid.
And that year was?
1966. Mm-hmm. And we had such things as educational opportunity grants come down the pike, and college work study, and guaranteed student loans, and all of those things which are a part of our lives today.
Do you recall about what it cost to be here as a student then as compared to your student days or today?
It's a little difficult, but I think the student budget for a full academic year in 1966 was about $500, including tuition fees and books.
A great change from your student days in the late 40s, but yet nothing compared to today.
That's right.
Now, how long did you stay in that particular office?
I stayed in that assignment for about 2 years, after which time I was named Associate Dean of Students and was given the responsibility for the financial aid, registrar, and admissions functions of the university.
So you had leadership role in relation to the department you had just left.
Yes.
You moved over with your good friend and our colleague, Don Flaster.
Right.
Now, this was also, if my dates are right in my head as we talk here, Bill, about that we're getting on toward the time of the merger now.
That is correct. 1968.
Now, that was a time of great change. Your feelings about that and what occurred and how it all went from your vantage point, because you were here through all that time too, Bill.
I think once again that fate intervened as far as this institution is concerned and provided the vehicle by which we could continue to operate. It was plain and simple that we were at the end of the road financially. There was no place to go.
Do you think if the if the city had approved Dr. Bale's and the university's push for additional funds earlier in the decade, we would have still stayed that way?
We still wouldn't have survived, Paul. It would not have been enough to be the difference, because immediately after the mill levy vote was on, our good friend from the western part of the state, Terry Carpenter, initiated a bill, the Junior College Aid Bill, which came up with about $200,000 a year for us.
Mm-hmm.
And that went on for 3 or 4 years before the merger, and that again was the difference, but still wasn't enough.
This was a bill to give support to the first 2 years of college for all our schools that were state-supported.
Right. And as I say, we got about $200,000 a year, which would have been about the same as we would have received under the mill levy, and did carry us up to that point in 1968 when we had the merger. But there's no question in my mind this institution would not be here today if we were dependent on anything other than state funding.
Now, our president, through that trying but interesting time, was Kirk Naylor, whom you mentioned earlier.
Right.
And that was a tough period to make adjustments to relationships that were just beginning. Your observations on that and on our friend Dr. Naylor? I
think Kirk Naylor faced some obstacles in the initial years of the merger that a lesser man could never have handled. He handled them with dignity and equanimity, and he didn't compromise in any way with his principles and his objectives as far as this institution were concerned. He fought for us literally down to his last breath when he was removed as the president of the institution. And I think his departure was triggered by his insistence that this university get its fair share in the allocation of state monies. I have tremendous admiration and respect for Kirk Naylor, and always will have for that reason.
Thank you for those comments. His strength has permeated our atmosphere throughout the years that have followed, too, and now he's in retirement on one of these tapes, too, and I'm happy that you made some of those very fine and positive comments about our friend Dr. Naylor. Now, you've moved over, and the transition has come. We're now a state institution. We're moving toward whatever the big time is, perhaps in some ways, and you're working with Don Flaster over in the Dean of Students office. But there are some changes on the horizon there, too, aren't there?
Yes, there are. In, what was it, 1970 or 69 or 70, Kirk Naylor, of course, was removed and succeeded by an interim president, Vic Blackwell, who served while a search committee was appointed to secure a new chief administrative officer, who ultimately, of course, came in the form of President Roskins, who is still, of course, the Chancellor of the University of Nebraska. Or no, he's the president, isn't he?
Yes, we turned...
I can't keep these straight.
Yes, it used to be president, now it's Chancellor, and he's the president, right?
However, when Roskins came here as president, he reorganized the university, completely shifted some personnel around into various areas, did away with some departments, including the Dean of Student Personnel Office, and as a result of that, in 1972, I was transferred to the Registrar's Office, where I have been to date.
Now, that was quite a change. We came into the era of Vice Chancellors, then, did we not?
Yes, we did.
And the role that Dean Flaster and you as assistant took, along with some additional duties, became Vice Chancellor for Student Affairs, right?
That is correct.
Now, as you said a moment ago, and we moved into the office where you are now, before we moved to that bill, there were some major changes affected under Dr. Roskins. Changes in the patterns of organization and relationships here, and the demise of some departments. You were strongly in favor, or at least felt that it was necessary that we have the merger in order to exist. What did you think of all the changes as they came down the pike? You've been here a long time now, and just like me, and it's kind of hard to change our stripes, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. The maintenance of the status quo is very important to everyone, and the older you get, the worse it gets.
Yeah.
I was disappointed to see the reorganization. I was very happy in what I was doing, and I felt that all in all, Flaster and the rest of us in that operation were doing a good job in the jobs to which we were assigned. Whether or not that's true, history will only prove, I guess. But nonetheless, we were all displaced and put in other areas. Happily, very few people lost their jobs in total as a result of all these shufflings around. We all did stay at the university, but by and large, most of us in somewhat lesser offices in terms of prestige than we had enjoyed before. That's progress, though.
Now, along with progress, I'd like to back off of that a minute. We're down to about our last 5 minutes or so of our reflections on your time here at the University, Bill. And you've mentioned some of them, but I'd like to have you sort of free think now back through history. You mentioned some of the key elements that made for change, and some of the people. But when you think of our university that you've been a part of for over 30 years, the first names that come to mind that had a great impact on what went on, students, faculty, staff, anybody, who are they in your memory?
Oh, certainly all of the presidents, without question. Starting with Roland Haynes, through Milo and Trawick in his own way, Vic Blackwell, and Roskins and Garfinkel. All of those people, of course, left their mark. We had some truly fine, strong deans, men like Bill Thompson and Bob Harper and Carl Helmstetter, John Lucas, very strong people, all of whom made, Frank Gorman, all of whom made tremendous contributions. Dropping down to faculty, I don't think there's any question, but what the early faculty we had was comprised of exceptionally gifted people. And over the years, the university has had a number of very talented and able faculty. The emphasis lately has switched a little bit from emphasis on teaching to publication and research, but that is not all bad either. And each in his own way, or his or her own way, now make a great contribution. Certainly there were regents of this institution, both the old OU and municipal regents, who made great contributions till I couldn't possibly think and list them all. But they, like us, who have been here a long time, each in their own way, you know, contributed something in greater or lesser degree to making this institution what it is today. And I personally take great pride in that, for what little contribution I may have made. And I'm grateful to have shared it with those giants who really made it possible. But, that I will remember and cherish.
Bill, one last thing before we leave it all. As you look ahead, we've been looking into the past for a long time, just a comment or two about what you think is ahead for us as a university.
I think that this institution will thrive in its present role of providing services to the metropolitan community and the contiguous counties. I think we will always continue to draw a large core of good, solid students here. I think we can provide a quality education to them without in any way impinging upon the greater role of our sister institution down the road. I don't think that we will see marked increases in enrollment in the future. The people just aren't there. I think we'll taper off at somewhere around 17,500 or 18,000, and that will be about the growth limitation of the university. I hope I'm wrong, but that's my personal feeling.
Bill, thanks for that personal feeling and all the rest that you've shared with us in this almost an hour now of your reflections and time. It's just great to have you. And
thank you for having me.
Our guest then has been Bill Gerbracht, our registrar here at UNO. We thank Bill, and we thank all of you for whatever part of these segments we've made, 4 of them now, have joined us in what we call this oral history report, Reflections in Time.